Welcome to the Faith and Trauma Center podcast, a unique approach to exploring the intersections of religion, trauma, sacred spaces, and mental health.
Each month, we choose a different topic to discuss weekly from different perspectives. The first week, we explore the faith, community, and clergy perspective. The second week, the mental health practitioner perspective. The third week, the perspective of individuals working to heal from religious trauma. And the fourth week, we invite a special guest who has been impacted by our monthly topic to join us.
This format follows the design of the Faith and Trauma Center's 3 pathways for resources and education. We invite you to explore all the additional material that we offer at faithandtraumacenter.org.
Let's jump into this week's conversation.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Faith and Trauma Center podcast. I am this week's host, Christy Love, and I'm joined by our co-founder and co-director at the Faith and Trauma Center, Holly Madden. And if you're new to the Faith and Trauma Center podcast, which most of you are because it's a new podcast, anyway, there's kind of a format and a flow that we use here. And the way that that works is that we choose a monthly topic. This month's topic for our first month is religious trauma, and just kind of unpackaging religious trauma. What is it? Understanding it a little bit better. And so the first week we talked about that through the lens of our faith and clergy pathway. This week, we're going to be talking about it from the lens of our mental health care professionals and practitioners pathway. And that is kind of the area that you lead, Holly, for us here at Faith and Trauma. So let's dive right into this conversation. And I want to kind of carry over a few things that we talked about from our previous conversation from episode 1. And that is just making sure that we are using similar language. I think this is a struggle that you and I kind of notice and talk about some, is understanding religious trauma from both a practitioner lens and from a spiritual lens really does require these two adjacent communities who are very tangential to each other in the work that we do, but we don't always overlap. And I think in a lot of communities and holistically as institutions, I don't think we have a good history of a lot of conversation connection points for us to figure out ways to create some shared language around issues that do overlap between, faith spaces and mental health practicing spaces. And so one of the big things I think that you and I've kind of talked about is, what does that look like for us to have a definition of religious trauma that is the same definition from a clinical lens, from a practitioner's lens, from a clergy lens, from a faith community lens? How do we kind of think of that holistically so that we're not changing how we define or look at religious trauma, but we're unpackaging it and coming at it from different angles, and the importance of that?
Yeah. Well, and I want to name too, before you share the definition that you've come up with that I love and use, is just how new religious trauma awareness in a community and a clinical setting is. I'm currently in grad school. I've done a lot of work in the field of trauma and mental health and working with people in the past, and I am now back in school to become licensed. And so I'm in grad school now, and I can tell you that the amount of times I bring up conversations around religious trauma in my discussion posts with my professors, and how many of my peers are like, I've never heard of that before. I've never heard it put that way, or that this is like a thing. Like it makes sense, but I've never actually heard that. And so I want to name that if you are in the mental health field and you're like, I've never honestly even been exposed to this on a clinical level, this is a much newer field. And that's why it's so important we're having this conversation. And so I just want to name that, because I think it's important to be when you're on the cutting edge of something.
Right, absolutely. And I think it's also important to name for you personally, as you kind of lead the mental health side of the Faith and Trauma Center, is really that was part of what brought you back to school. Like, you already had a master's degree. You were already doing work in, trauma recovery work, and you were doing a lot of work in just mental health support and counseling systems and things like that, especially in a ministry context. But really for you wanted to be able to go and pursue the licensure specifically so that you could help create some of these treatment modalities and really kind of catalyze this conversation within the mental health community. And that's something that I really respect and admire about you and your heart.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate
So,
that.
so let's look at this definition. So the definition that we use here at the Faith and Trauma Center for religious trauma was derived from my doctoral work that I did, which really looked at religious trauma through the lens of something we call negative religious experiences. And we'll unpackage that here in just a minute a little bit more. But using that lens, the definition that we kind of really build everything upon is that religious trauma is defined as the short and long-term effects of negative religious experiences on an individual or a group's faith, health, relationships, and quality of life. And so it's this idea, right, that religious trauma impacts us in short-term and lifelong ways. And it is not something that just impacts or undermines our spiritual life or our faith development. It is something that for some people who have much more complex negative religious experience exposures, it really has the potential to undermine every area of their life. So, Holly, from a mental health perspective, and someone who's worked on the front lines of a lot of this cutting edge religious trauma work, how do you respond to that particular definition, and why does that resonate with you so much?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, when you talk about trauma in general, one of, I think, the most important piece to acknowledge anytime you talk about trauma is how integrated trauma response is in our bodies in this like holistic way. Like it's not just a, oh, I need to cure this one part of me, or I need to, it's not a mind thing, it's not a gut thing. Like it's literally this integrated experience. And that is more significant with the more, especially like prolonged trauma, or if it's been like compounded trauma, which means it's happened over and over again. And what we see with religious trauma is, yes, there are going to be experiences where someone's like, I had no religious upbringing. I went to this one service. It was traumatic. I left, it was, I can pinpoint a time. I can pinpoint a moment. But for so many people, religious trauma is so integrated in everything because it was culture. It like religion shapes culture. And so it's the culture you are often raised in. I think a lot of people with religious trauma can pinpoint it to childhood. That's not true for everybody, but that's really common that it's the culture you were raised in, which also has this element of choice because religion is a choice, but as children, we often can't choose the religion that we're raised in. And so you have that exposure of it. And when we talk about religion, it can be any religion. Like this isn't just evangelical Christianity. We do talk about that a lot because that is our backgrounds. But I think that's really important. Like it's the culture. There's this like lack of choice. There is this element of, so oftentimes religion speaks to identity, to self-worth, to self-esteem. We see very high instances of especially women, queer individuals who may have a lot of religious trauma around their appearance and their body modesty issues, like that purity culture piece of it. And so that can shape even how we feel about ourselves for decades. And how we feel comfortable in our body or not. It shapes the way that we have relationships. There's a lot of sometimes language around how we're supposed to have romantic relationships or how we're supposed to engage with people who believe differently than us. And so when you look at all of these different facets, in fact, like an element that I'm incredibly passionate about is how often religion and mental health kind of clash inside of religious spaces. So sometimes faith spaces do really well with honoring mental health. Oftentimes that's not the case. You see language around pray it away or rituals or dismissing mental health symptoms. And so we see a lot of trauma around that. And so I want to name those things because I think it's really important that we see this as a holistic thing and how oftentimes people who experience religious trauma, first of all, a lot of people may not feel comfortable or even know that that's something to name. Like, oh, I've experienced this as traumatic. Like I just, I had this experience. But how often too, it's showing up, the religious trauma is showing up as I'm not doing well in my relationships. Like my mental health is suffering. I have horrible self-esteem that's led to an eating disorder or addictions or all those pieces. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about those connections, but it's that holistic suffering and struggling that makes that definition so important.
Yeah. So there's two things that you just said that I really want to make sure that we highlight. Number one, you talked about kind of that not having a choice in participating, and especially if you grew up in a religious framework. So one of the things that we discovered in a lot of my religious trauma research work that we did is one of the, I call them affinity groups, right? When you've got a group of people who've had similar experiences. So for example, queer individuals would make up an affinity group, right? Hispanic individuals would make up an affinity group because they have a similar culture, a similar background, a similar lived experience. Individuals that were in the foster care system would make up an affinity group. So one of the affinity groups that we see incredibly high rates of religious trauma and very high negative religious experience scores, which we'll explain here in just a second, that scoring system, are individuals who were forced to go to church and could not self-select out of that community or that experience until after they were an adult. And so that lack of consent and that lack of autonomy really becomes something that is very damaging to people who don't feel like they have a voice in the things that they're exposed to. And so there's some really good work that Dr. Laura Anderson has done. And she kind of created a power and control wheel for religious trauma. And it's based on the Duluth Power and Control Wheel that, focuses mostly on domestic violence. But what Dr. Anderson was able to do was really kind of document that, especially in that high control situation where there's not a lot of autonomy, where there's not always the ability to give consent to participating in things, that we see some of these very similar elements. And so I think it's important for mental health practitioners to recognize that many times people that you're working with who have had high negative religious experience scores very well present like someone who is trying to leave a domestic violence situation. There's a lot of similarities in behavior. There's a lot of similarities in thought pattern. And so we've got that power and control wheel from Dr. Anderson in the resource library on the faith and trauma pathway for mental health professionals. I really encourage you to have that, to use that as a resource, because I think that helps you to understand some things.
Yeah. And I want to name and just like capitalize on that just a little bit too, because when you think about that lack of choice, that level of impact can be even stronger when that lack of choice is not the family that you were raised in, but maybe a family you were placed in. And so we see that there's like a really, really high rate of experiences around religious trauma for kids that were in the foster care system or kids who were adopted. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I think that's a really important thing to name, because I just want to call out, like in especially the 90s, the early 2000s, there was this huge movement of almost all of this work had this like adjacency to spirituality, because it was seen as like saving and protecting and immersing in this positive environment. And so many people came out of that and said that was really harmful to me. Like that was really damaging. And just that reshaping that lens of when you hear someone tell their story and it's got those elements of it, like checking in with them to say, like, how was that experience? Was that a good experience for you? And not assuming either direction, because I think that's really important to see some of those red flags for different people groups.
Absolutely. And I think those affinity groups that are hyper vulnerable are important to have on your radar, right? And so, people that couldn't leave religious spaces until they were an adult, foster care kids like that you named, Holly. I think also keeping in mind anyone who's had a homeschool experience, very likely, especially if that was a religious homeschool curriculum experience, they very well may have a high negative religious experience score. We also know that individuals in the queer community typically are considered hyper vulnerable and would have a higher negative religious experience score. We also see high negative religious experience scores with individuals whose parents were in ministry or on the mission field. And so those are some of those groups that if you're working with someone and those lived experiences come up, like you just said, be aware of that. And that's when you really might know, okay, this is something where I think we need to look at what this negative religious experience score is and exposure. Maybe that helps me understand some things. So we keep referencing that. So let's talk about negative religious experiences.
I was going to ask you to go
down
your list.
Core system just a little bit. So we have actually created a worksheet that can really be used by practitioners as kind of an evaluation form. It's a two-sided form. So on the first side, it's going to ask for screening from some of these hypervulnerabilities, right? So it's going to ask, Did this individual maybe to attend a private faith-based institution for school at some point? Did this individual at some point possibly work for a faith-based nonprofit or a church? Was this individual homeschooled? Did this individual, kind of all these different pieces, so that if the answer to any of these is yes, we probably need to flip the page over and do a negative religious score system with them and kind of assess that to see where they fall. One of the things that we wanted to do in this research was kind of model this after the ACEs study. And the reason for that is because I'm a big believer in evidence-based practices and the importance of having good data to back up things and to show us that things are really effective in how we do things. So when I began this work as my doctoral case study, what I really did was kind of look to model and how can we replicate data, but so that it's focused on negative religious experiences. So like the ACEs model, we identified 10 negative religious experiences. However, unlike ACEs, which you can only score in a binary fashion, right? 0 or 1, haven't had it, did have it. I really felt like it was important that we had a little bit more of the ability to give a nuanced score that said, I had that a little bit, but maybe not a lot, or I had that a lot. That was a huge piece of my life. So for negative religious experiences, we use a scoring system of 0 to 4 for every one of these 10 exposures. And so using that worksheet, then you can ask clients to go through and kind of score themselves, and you end up with a total score that then shows you kind of their level of overall negative religious experiences or their level of religious trauma potentially. So those 10 exposures, I'm going to kind of run through them, Holly, and then I want you to kind of unpackage these from that mental health perspective and what that might look like in session with clients and as you're working with people. So the first one that we look at is forced high moral or ethical standards. And so if that was really ingrained in them, that you've got to be a good person, you can't make mistakes. Sometimes there's scripture that's used around that, to be perfect as Jesus was perfect, right? And so this idea that you've got to have it all together all the time can really become an internalized narrative for people that have been raised in a highly religious environment. Number 2, the inability to express doubts, right? Not able to question, not able to say, why do I have to go to this? Why do I have to believe this? I'm not sure I agree with this, without, getting punished or really evoking some large reaction from individuals in their lives. The third one is controlling caregivers. Again, that kind of goes back to that power and control wheel that we talked about. That can look like a lot of different aspects of high control. A lot of times we talk about things like having what you wore controlled, what you were allowed to watch, what you were allowed to listen to, where you were allowed to go, who you could hang out with, those kind of things. But that's not just exclusive for that young adult or child experience. There's also aspects of high control environment that also manifest in adults. We also see weaponized scripture or weaponized theological concepts is another one that we look at. So this could be verses that are taken out of context. A lot of times in theological circles, we use the language of the clobber passages that are often taken out of context and used against the queer community frequently, and how those are kind of weaponized. Also concepts like the concept of hell. A lot of people that grew up in a faith-filled household, they maybe were exposed to language like, well, if you do that, you're going to hell, right? And then you've got 8, 9, 10-year-olds laying in bed at night imagining, this kind of eternal damnation that becomes part of their psyche and their internal narrative and internal self-talk. The fifth one is the use of guilt and shame. And what that looks like when guilt and shame is really used as a parenting tool, as a caregiving tool, as a manipulative tool to try to control an outcome of behavior. The sixth one that we measure is patriarchy. And what does that look like to grow up or be exposed to an ideology that really espouses male headship, right? That men are uniquely qualified to lead in faith spaces, uniquely qualified for leadership in general in the world. They are more fit to be a boss in the business place, that women's place is more of a traditional gender role. So if that was something that someone was exposed to, that can definitely have an impact on them, whether they are identify as male, female, non-binary, or otherwise. We see that patriarchy has a lot of links, especially to high instances of domestic violence and other pieces. Next, we look at corporal punishment or physical abuse. There's a lot we can unpackage here. I'm sure that will be a monthly theme that we will unpackage in this negative religious experience alone.
Yeah.
But if you've been in a faith-based household, phrases like, spare the rod, spoil the child, those kind of things that really teach spanking as a holy act. But those kind of punishments and the way that they impact people, impact children. Number 8 is toxic faith community or leader experience. So if you've had a toxic pastor that maybe manipulated or used someone or violated boundaries in some way. Number 9 is not being able to be your authentic self. A lot of times we see this associated with the queer community who maybe felt they had to stay closeted. But we also see it with things like your political ideology or your scientific beliefs or the way that you look at the world, just a little different on social issues. And then finally, the last one is kind of usually connected to at least one or more others, and that's estrangement from family or support systems. And so if you don't feel safe being yourself, if you've not been allowed to question, or you can't fully embody who you are, but then you decide I can't do this anymore, and you decide to embody that, and there's a level of estrangement there. Or you are the one who makes the decision to push away because you just don't feel safe in that space anymore. If there's been a family estrangement, we also would consider that to be a negative religious experience.
My gosh, there's so much to unpackage. I'm like, my brain is just going like, what is the most important pieces? Where do I want to go with this? I think one of the things I want to start with is, when would you want to use a tool like this? And like any type of assessment tool, there's this, the elements of consent, being able to make sure that that's something that your client or the person that you're caring for is on board with that. And that being said, that that's kind of an element of either they've said, I think I have religious trauma, or I know I have religious trauma, but like, how deep is it? And wanting to explore that more. But I would also just say that if you are picking up on this from somebody that you're caring for, like, man, I hear these things in you, these themes in you, that there's also this element, and it's very similar to family trauma, especially when you have like abusive parents. Sexual abuse is a huge experience of this too, where the person that's harmed may be very defensive and protective of that person still, and that can be very similar with religious trauma. Like, oh, but this, oh, that wasn't traumatic. Like, oh, they fed me. This was a place I always had food. This was a place where I had, like, my family went. There can even be these really complicated elements there of like, well, the pastor was really traumatic, but I went every week with my grandma, and my grandma passed away when I was young. And so these are the good memories I have with her. So there can be so many like integrated elements of contradiction with that. And so just really speaking into the need for just like gentleness and sensitivity, and acknowledging that there can be good, beautiful things that came out of that, and also traumatic things. And it's not you're not focusing on only one, you're factoring on both. And this can be just let's like explore maybe the ways that this has, that this has maybe impacted you, so that we can support you as you're like deconstructing that or working through that.
Right. I think it's all about helping to make those connections. So an experience I had recently with someone that I was working with, who's been attending a religious trauma support group that I lead, they were introduced to this model at a seminar that I was teaching. It was a faith and trauma workshop that they came to. They grew up in a household where their dad was a minister, and they are a social work student, so they're very familiar with ACEs. They had a low ACE score. Their ACE score was 1. And they kind of felt like, man, I always had it together. I was pretty well off and financially well off, and parents took care of me. I never really suffered any major traumatic events. And so by definition, they always kind of felt like, I really don't have anything to complain about. And so, they've done a lot of research around ACEs and different things, but they are also someone who has struggled with mental health. They have struggled with addiction. They have dealt with a lot of inconsistencies in their relationships and in their life, and they just couldn't figure it out. And to them, they felt like, man, this feels like maybe this is a faith issue for me, because like haven't had these difficulties and struggles that would explain these. But when they sat there and they listened to this negative religious experience research, the light bulb just went off and off and off. And it was like, oh my goodness, I used to have nightmares about hell. Oh my goodness, I used to, be terrified that my best friend who died in a car accident wasn't saved and that's my fault. And now they're going to be in hell because of me. And just kept kind of naming all of these things that had lived inside of them. And, those, I couldn't ever be good enough. I wasn't a good enough Christian. The reasons that they were, recognizing that they were using substances to cope had so many roots to that.
Yeah.
And so it finally gave them language to say, now I understand, and almost permission to say, it's okay for me to struggle with anxiety because now I see that, like, I may not have fit this model, but in this model, like, it recognized the unique experience that I had and I grew up in, and it sees that this has had some negative impacts on me, and that was really, really affirming for them and allowed them to move forward in some treatments.
Yeah, I would say I think one of the biggest things you see that's really common, and it's not everybody obviously, but it's that concept of like, I'm not a good person.
Yeah.
And it's how much that like challenges everything. And I heard this somewhere, and it's just I can't remember now who to cite this to. So, but I feel led to share it anyway. There's this extremely strong correlation between rebellious behavior and religious trauma, and that's just like, and I think that's like a normal thing. Like you think of religion and rebellion, like those things go well together. And I heard this stated that what if we reframed the way we saw rebellion and we named it survival?
Yeah.
And how many times people are doing things to survive because they're trying to combat these really harmful narratives and these things that dehumanize them or that put them down because of their culture. We see a lot of religious trauma in Black culture, a lot of people that were said, you're valuable, but your culture's not. You have to change, you have to shape shift to fit into this place, to be good, to be pure. So much of my work has been done with families in the foster care system, and the correlation between foster care and poverty are extremely high and close together. And we see a lot of that too. There's a lot of really odd spaces where you wouldn't think that could be triggering.
Yeah.
I worked with several people that, let alone in a search situation, walking into court is triggering, but the concept of walking in and someone standing behind, like standing up and talking to you, can be really triggering, and that can have some roots in religious trauma. Sometimes even going to a support group where there's an element or a setting where there's like chairs that are in a circle or seated in rows, that can have these elements of triggering if there's like the community triggers. And so I just share that to say there's so many of these elements, but I think that piece of, am I good? Am I bad? Like I'm innately this bad person, and how much we see religious trauma has links to addiction, has links to those like typically rebellious, I'm putting those in quotation, behaviors, but they're very survival based. There's lots of self-harm. There's a lot of those pieces that have very strong correlations.
Right. Absolutely. And so where I think that this tool can become helpful from kind of like a worksheet assessment perspective is one of the things that we are doing through this research. So a lot of this research is based upon a 508 participant study, case study that we did, but we're in the middle here at Faith and Trauma Center of doing a large multi-year national research study to kind of look at these correlations and how they hold up. Because what we are seeing is that we can kind of put people into score categories, right? So for someone that scores in a trace religious trauma category, low, medium, high, or extreme, some of the things that we see for people who score in high and extreme, especially people who score in extreme, extreme scores are oftentimes 91% more likely to be dealing with anxiety and depression, right? We see people with extreme religious trauma scores oftentimes are more than 30% more likely to deal with eating disorders. We see correlations to higher use of substance abuse. We see correlations with higher degrees of homelessness, higher degrees of poverty, a lot of those kind of pieces. And so being able to see where these scores fit in and then start to kind of unpackage and connect some of those experiences and the whys behind some of those coping skills and behaviors and patterns, I think can really be very, very helpful for people to be able to break into. And so my hope is that, this is the beginning of a lot of work that needs to be done. You talked about how this is very cutting edge work. You're not going to find diagnostic pieces for religious trauma in the DSM. And so this is something that's kind of, I heard one researcher call it the Wild West. And there's probably some truth to that right now, right? Like, I think we have to be very careful. We need to be looking for things that are evidence-based and well-researched. We have built, I created a religious trauma certificate program here at the Faith and Trauma Center. And I really encourage you to consider taking that course and investing in that course. There's a lot of evidence-based data and research, not only from our research, but pulling in other studies and medical journals, kind of looking at some of these different negative religious experiences one at a time. It's a large certificate. It's 26 modules long, but it will really help you understand these correlations, what those scores can mean for people. And I think that that's really important.
Yeah.
So
we have quite a few other resources on our website. And so when you go to Faith and Trauma Center, if you click on the pathway for mental health, we have quite a few resources on there, including we've done I have a background in trauma, grounding, meditation work, earthing practices. And so I have all of that's included in there. So there's some earthing practices, which can be a really helpful coping skill, because there's often this disconnect in religion from the wild world, and like, again, it's this like good versus bad, and sometimes that connection to the wild world can be seen as bad. And so a lot of times I've seen so many people just crave, and this is my own experience, crave connection to the wild. So earthing practices like going outside barefoot, connecting with water, those things can be really healing coping strategies to give someone who's maybe dealing with some of the manifestations of those trauma responses. There is a boundaries guided meditation to just kind of reconnect with the body after talking about religious trauma, which might be helpful to send someone home with after a session. We have a really powerful worksheet that you put together. And I want to speak this very briefly because I know we don't have a lot of time as we're trying to honor your time, but it's been really important that if you work in a field, especially if you're working with people who are living in poverty, homelessness, foster care, like these very vulnerable experiences people may be existing in, these are high referral based organizations. And what we see is, especially in high faith parts of the country, but it's everywhere too. And so we experienced that in Missouri. There was so much faith-based referrals, but that's also true here and in a little bit more liberal parts of the country. But how oftentimes the resources for food banks and clothing pantries, I said that wrong. Did I say that right? I said that wrong. But food, clothes, even counseling resources can be in this category. Resources on shelter, they often correlate with faith-based organizations, and some do it really, really well, some don't. And so you've put together, if you want to talk about it for a few minutes, a really powerful worksheet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this is a crucial piece that every mental health practitioner, every social worker, every social services practitioner needs to have in their toolbox. Because if you do have a high concentration of faith-based social service resources, if you know that you're working with someone who has religious trauma, being able to tell them ahead of time, you're going to deal with some potential triggers when you go to this place. But this is the place, unfortunately, in our community that may have the resource that you need. And so oftentimes what I really encourage practitioners to do is to use a worksheet like this one and literally go and visit the site of where clients would be going to for services. Observe some of the things, make note of some things. And so we put this checklist together that I'm not going to go through the whole thing. You can download it. You can check it out in the Faith and Trauma Center Mental Health Pathway Resource Library. But things like, is there religious art on the wall? Are they playing religious music? Do the staff members wear religious language on their shirts? Are individuals required to attend a religious service before they can eat a meal or receive services? Do they support the LGBTQ population? Is that a safe referral for individuals that are queer to even be aware of? So going through, asking those questions, paying attention, and kind of making notes of possible triggers when you do have to refer someone, especially if you're in a small rural area where maybe you don't have other options and this is the resource. Even if you can't replace the resource, you can at least do your due diligence to help prepare, individuals and clients ahead of time and say, these are some things you're going to experience. What are some tools that we could use with you to help mitigate that? Like, if I know that there's going to be religious music playing and that may be a trigger, and there may be specific songs that are really difficult for you, can you put some headphones in and can you play some, bilateral music in your earphones to help keep you calm and maybe drown some of that out, but play it low enough you can still interact with people and hear people, right? Like, what are some of those kind of techniques? If you get anxious, can you do some tapping, right? And just trying to prepare them for that space so that they don't just walk in and are blindsided by a lot of these religious trauma triggers. That's really critical.
Yeah. And we know, especially music is one of the most, can trigger some of the biggest reactions in people. And so, yeah, just being preparation is so good. There's been a lot of research done too, in the way that trauma and religious trauma is no different, and the correlation of healing that comes from just creativity and art practices. We have some guided art prompts as well. But I'd also just encourage that, like, so much of the modalities of maybe helping with some coping mechanisms is kind of grounded in the grounding techniques around those kind of initial, I'm aware of religious trauma, I'm starting to work through of it, like tap into the kind of alternative modalities of healing and how beneficial that has kind of been studied. So there's finger. So yeah, there's a lot that we've created, a lot that we're creating, as we really, so much of our work is on religious trauma, both for you as a pastor and in the faith world, me in the mental health world. So we'll be adding more and more, but we hope that those resources are good. We also hope that this just gives you some education to kind of experience, to explore for yourself. And so I would really encourage you to take Christy's religious trauma certificate. It's a go at your own pace. I think you already said that. So I know if you're busy, it's something that you can do really slowly too, but just to have that exposure, I think is really important to just help us be more exposed, because when you're in grad school, you learn there are things that you will run into. You will run into people who deal with substance use. You will run into multicultural and diversity experiences. You will run into religious trauma. It's just not really talked about a lot yet. And so I hope that this has been helpful for you.
Yeah. Absolutely. And the other big thing is I really encourage you and I really invite you to use this podcast as the tool that we hope that it becomes, right? That each month, as we look at a different aspect of kind of the intersection of faith and trauma and mental health and healing work, the second week of that conversation every month is specifically geared for you as mental health practitioners, social work practitioners. And so, kind of make a note to yourself to come back and revisit this resource regularly, because we'll be talking about not only things that we're looking at, we're researching, but we'll be talking about kind of some of the cutting edge stuff that's coming out, and articles and studies and journal entries, and so we can kind of help you stay on top of that, because it's a passion of ours as well. So I hope that you will return and be part of this conversation on a regular basis and use this podcast as a tool in your practice. All right. Well, hopefully we will see you guys back again very soon, and we'll have our next conversation together.